Special Agent Maya Rivers had always been someone who thrived under pressure. Her days were filled with chasing leads, interrogating suspects, and piecing together clues to solve some of the most complex cases in the country. But on this particular evening, as she drove down a quiet stretch of highway outside the city limits, her mind wasn't on work. Instead, she was thinking about how nice it would feel to finally relax at home after such a long day. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of deep orange and purple. The road ahead was mostly empty, save for an occasional car passing by in the opposite direction. Maya's favorite playlist hummed softly through the speakers, filling the silence with soothing melodies. She tapped her fingers lightly against the steering wheel, feeling the tension from her day slowly melt away. But just as she began to settle into the calm rhythm of the drive, blue and red lights suddenly flashed in her rearview mirror. Maya blinked, momentarily confused. She hadn't noticed anyone behind her until now. Slowing down, she glanced at her speedometer to make sure she wasn't accidentally going over the limit. But no, she was well within the legal range. Still, she knew better than to argue with flashing lights. With a small sigh, she signaled and pulled onto the shoulder, turning off her music as she came to a stop. Maya followed every rule she'd ever learned about traffic stops. She kept both hands visible on the steering wheel and waited patiently for the officer to approach. As the seconds ticked by, she watched him step out of his patrol car in her side mirror. His silhouette was tall and broad-shouldered, his movements deliberate as he adjusted his belt and grabbed his flashlight. Something about his posture struck her as odd. It wasn't relaxed or casual like most officers she'd encountered during routine stops. There was a stiffness to him, almost as if he were bracing himself for something. When the officer finally reached her window, he didn't say anything at first. Instead, he shone his flashlight directly into her face, forcing her to squint against the blinding beam. Maya instinctively leaned back slightly, trying not to appear confrontational. "Evening, officer," she said politely, keeping her voice calm and steady. "Is there a reason I've been pulled over?" For a moment, there was silence. Then, without asking for her license or registration, the officer launched into a string of accusations. "Do you have any idea how fast you were going?" he demanded, his tone sharp and accusatory. Maya frowned, taken aback by the sudden hostility. "I don't believe I was speeding, sir," she replied carefully. "If you could let me know what the issue is." Her attempt to clarify only seemed to irritate him further. He cut her off mid-sentence, raising his voice as though she challenged him outright. "Don't tell me what I saw," he snapped. "You were flying down this road like you own it. You think you're above the rules." Maya felt her stomach tighten. This wasn't how these situations usually played out, especially not for someone like her, a seasoned investigator used to navigating high-stakes scenarios. She reminded herself to stay composed, to breathe deeply, and assess the situation logically. But there was something unsettling about the way the officer loomed over her car, his body language radiating aggression rather than authority. As the conversation continued, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about a supposed traffic violation. The officer's words carried an edge that went beyond professional enforcement. It felt personal. And though she didn't want to jump to conclusions, she couldn't ignore the fact that similar stories had made headlines before. Stories where people who looked like her ended up in dangerous situations simply because they dared to exist in spaces where others thought they didn't belong. Little did Maya know, this encounter was about to take a turn neither she nor the officer could have anticipated. What started as a mundane evening drive was about to become one of the most defining moments of her life. And it would leave an indelible mark on everyone involved. The officer's demeanor grew more hostile with each passing second. His flashlight beam remained fixed on Maya's face, making it hard for her to see anything beyond the blinding light. She squinted, trying to maintain eye contact despite the discomfort. Her polite tone hadn't softened him in the slightest. If anything, it seemed to fuel his frustration. "You hear me talking to you," he barked, leaning closer to her window. Don't act like you didn't know what you were doing." Maya swallowed hard but kept her voice steady. "Sir, I'm happy to cooperate," she said, choosing her words carefully. "But I really don't believe I was speeding. Can we clarify this? Maybe check your radar." Her calm response only seemed to irritate him further. He scoffed loudly, shaking his head as though she'd just insulted him. "Oh, so now you're questioning my equipment?" He shot back, his voice rising. "You think I don't know how to do my job?" Maya could feel her pulse quickening, though she did her best not to show it. She had been trained to stay composed under pressure, but something about this situation felt different, more unpredictable. Most officers she encountered during traffic stops, even those who were stern or impatient, still followed basic protocol. They asked for licenses and registrations before jumping to conclusions. This man, however, seemed determined to escalate things without cause. "Sir, I'm not questioning anything," Maya replied, keeping her hands firmly on the steering wheel. "I just want to understand why I've been pulled over. If there's a mistake, maybe we can clear it up quickly." But her attempt at de-escalation fell flat. The officer stepped back slightly, folding his arms across his chest. His expression hardened, and for a brief moment, Maya thought she saw a flicker of disdain cross his face. It wasn't the kind of look someone gave when they simply disagreed. It was deeper, colder, as if her very presence offended him. "You people always have excuses," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for Maya to hear. The comment hit her like a punch to the gut. "You people." Those two small words carried a weight that couldn't be ignored. They weren't part of any standard script for a routine traffic stop. This wasn't about driving anymore. It was about who she was. Maya clenched her jaw, forcing herself to stay focused. She reminded herself that reacting emotionally would only make things worse. Still, the tension between them continued to build. The officer began pacing alongside her car, shining his flashlight into the backseat and then inside the trunk, searching for what? Evidence, a reason to justify his aggression. Whatever it was, Maya knew she hadn't given him one. Then came the moment that made her blood run cold. Without warning, the officer stopped pacing and turned back toward her window. He rested one hand on the grip of his holstered gun, his fingers tapping lightly against the weapon. "Listen up," he said, his voice low and menacing. "If you keep giving me attitude, I won't hesitate to take you out of this car myself. Understand?" Maya froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She had faced dangerous criminals in her line of work, but nothing prepared her for this. A law enforcement officer threatening her while supposedly enforcing the law. For a split second, she considered reaching for her own identification again, hoping it might remind him of her authority. But something held her back. Would he even believe her? Or would showing her badge provoke him further? Time seemed to slow down as Maya weighed her options. She glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting another patrol car to appear and break the tension. But the road behind them remained empty, stretching endlessly into the darkness. There was no backup coming. Not yet, anyway. It was just her and this increasingly volatile officer standing in the glow of their headlights. As she sat there, immobilized by fear and uncertainty, Maya realized something crucial. This wasn't going to end quietly. Whatever happened next, she needed to be ready for the worst-case scenario. Yes, but also for the possibility that she might need to fight back, not physically, but strategically. Because one thing was certain, she wasn't going to let anyone intimidate her into silence. Not tonight. Maya's mind raced as she tried to figure out her next move. She couldn't let this situation spiral further out of control, but she also knew that staying silent wouldn't help either. The officer was already on edge, and his hand hovering near his gun sent a clear message. He wasn't afraid to use it if he felt challenged. Maya had to act carefully. Every word, every gesture mattered now. Taking a slow, deliberate breath, she decided it was time to reveal her identity. If he understood who she was, a federal agent, he might realize the gravity of what he was doing and back off. With measured movements, she reached toward her jacket pocket, where her FBI badge was tucked away. "Officer," she said calmly, her voice firm but non-threatening, "I need you to listen to me for a moment." The officer immediately tensed at her movement. His eyes narrowed, and his hand instinctively tightened around the grip of his holstered weapon. "What are you reaching for?" he demanded sharply, stepping closer to her window. "Keep your hands where I can see them." "I'm getting my badge," Maya replied quickly, freezing in place with her hand still halfway to her pocket. "I'm Special Agent Maya Rivers with the FBI. This is clearly a misunderstanding." For a brief moment, there was silence. The officer stared at her, his expression unreadable under the dim glow of the streetlights. Then, slowly, he tilted his head, his lips curling into a smirk. "Yeah, right," he scoffed, his tone dripping with mockery. "You expect me to believe that? You think I don't know what a real badge looks like?" Maya felt a chill run down her spine. He didn't believe her. Worse, he thought she was lying, or worse yet, trying to pull some kind of trick. Ignoring the knot forming in her stomach, she forced herself to continue. "Sir, please," she said, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling beneath the surface. "Just look at it. You'll see it's legitimate." But instead of calming him down, her insistence seemed to push him over the edge. His smirk vanished, replaced by an expression of pure anger. In one swift motion, he unholstered his gun and pointed it directly at her chest. Maya's breath hitched as she stared down the barrel of the weapon, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear anything else. "You're not fooling anyone," the officer shouted, his voice shaking with rage. "Step out of the car right now, or I swear, I'll make you regret it." Maya's mind screamed at her to comply, but something inside her refused to give in to blind obedience. She had done nothing wrong, and she wasn't about to let this man intimidate her into submission. Still, survival instincts kicked in. Slowly, she raised her hands higher, keeping them visible above the steering wheel. Okay, she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm not resisting. Just, please, lower your weapon." But the officer showed no sign of backing down. Instead, he stepped even closer, his finger dangerously close to the trigger. "Don't tell me what to do," he barked, his face flushed with fury. "Get out of the car, or I'll drag you out myself." In that instant, Maya realized she needed to act fast. Her training told her never to escalate a confrontation unnecessarily, but she also knew she couldn't rely on this man coming to his senses. Reaching deep within herself, she activated the emergency alert system built into her phone, a feature designed specifically for situations like this. It sent an immediate notification to her bureau chief and nearby field offices, alerting them to her location and predicament. As the signal went through, Maya locked eyes with the officer. Despite the terror coursing through her veins, she managed to speak with surprising clarity. "You're making a huge mistake," she said, her voice unwavering. "Help is already on the way." The officer hesitated for a fraction of a second, his confidence faltering ever so slightly. But then he shook his head, dismissing her warning as another attempt to manipulate him. "Shut up," he snapped, waving his gun for emphasis. "Nobody's coming to save you." What neither of them realized was that help was already en route. Within moments, the distant sound of screeching tires broke the tension-filled air, announcing the arrival of multiple vehicles. Bright headlights flooded the scene as armed FBI agents spilled out, surrounding the area with weapons drawn. The officer froze, his bravado crumbling as he realized the tables had turned, and turned decisively. For Maya, relief washed over her like a tidal wave. She wasn't alone anymore. Backup had arrived just in time. The sound of screeching tires shattered the tense standoff, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Maya's heart was still racing, but as she caught sight of the familiar black SUVs pulling up behind the officer's patrol car, a flicker of hope ignited within her. She recognized the vehicles instantly. They belonged to the FBI. Her emergency alert had worked. Help had arrived. The officer, however, didn't share her relief. His grip on the gun wavered slightly as he turned his head toward the commotion, his eyes widening in disbelief. Armed agents poured out of the vehicles, their weapons drawn and pointed directly at him. The red and blue lights from the SUVs bathed the scene in an eerie glow, amplifying the gravity of the situation. For the first time since the encounter began, the officer looked unsure of himself. "Drop your weapon," one of the agents shouted, his voice cutting through the night like a knife. "Step away from the vehicle now." Maya watched as the color drained from the officer's face. His earlier bravado evaporated completely, replaced by sheer panic. He glanced back at her, his expression a mix of confusion and fear, as though he couldn't comprehend how things had spiraled so far out of his control. Slowly, hesitantly, he lowered the gun and raised his hands above his head. Another agent rushed to Maya's side, crouching beside her open window. "Agent Rivers, are you okay?" he asked urgently, his eyes scanning her for any signs of injury. "I'm fine," Maya replied, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound calm. "Just get me out of here." The agent nodded and motioned for her to step out of the car. As she did, another colleague draped a protective jacket over her shoulders, shielding her from the cool night air. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world to Maya. It reminded her that she wasn't alone, that there were people who had her back no matter what. Meanwhile, the officer stood frozen in place, surrounded by federal agents. One of them approached cautiously, instructing him to kneel on the ground with his hands behind his head. The man complied without argument, his earlier aggression replaced by quiet submission. Maya watched as they handcuffed him, reading him his rights in a clipped, professional tone. She felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, anger, and even pity. This wasn't how law enforcement was supposed to work. Officers were meant to protect and serve, not intimidate and threaten. As the scene unfolded, Maya took a few steps back, trying to process everything that had just happened. Her legs felt weak, and her hands were still shaking, but she forced herself to stay upright. A senior agent walked over to her, concern etched across his face. "We got your alert," he explained. "When we realized it was you, we mobilized immediately. Are you sure you're all right?" Maya nodded, though she knew the answer wasn't entirely true. Physically, she was unharmed, but emotionally, she felt raw. "I'll be okay," she said softly. "Thank you for getting here so fast. I don't know what would have happened if—" She stopped herself before finishing the sentence. There was no point dwelling on what could have been. What mattered now was that she was safe. By this point, other officers from the local precinct had arrived, alerted by the commotion. Some of them exchanged uneasy glances as they took in the surreal scene, one of their own kneeling on the ground in handcuffs while federal agents secured the area. Whispers rippled through the crowd, and Maya could hear fragments of conversations, some expressing disbelief, others quietly acknowledging that the officer had gone too far. One of the agents handed Maya a bottle of water and guided her to the back of an SUV, encouraging her to sit down and collect herself. As she sipped the water, she noticed the officer being led to a patrol car, his head bowed in shame. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Maya saw something unexpected in his gaze. Not defiance or hostility, but regret. Whether it was genuine remorse or simply the weight of consequences sinking in, she couldn't tell. And frankly, she didn't care. All that mattered was that justice was finally being served. As the chaos began to settle, Maya allowed herself a single deep breath. The nightmare was over. For now. But she knew this wasn't the end of the story. There would be questions to answer, reports to file, and decisions to make about how to handle a fallout. Still, in that moment, surrounded by colleagues who cared about her safety, she felt a glimmer of peace. She had survived. And more importantly, she had proven that even in the face of intimidation, truth and accountability could prevail. The precinct buzzed with activity as news of the incident spread like wildfire. Officers whispered in hushed tones, their faces a mix of disbelief, anger, and unease. Some defended the officer who had been arrested, claiming he must have misunderstood the situation or acted out of stress. Others remained silent, unwilling to take sides but unable to ignore the weight of what had happened. In a corner of the room, Maya sat at a small table, her hands wrapped around a cup of lukewarm coffee. She felt drained, physically, mentally, and emotionally. But she knew this was far from over. Across from her sat two internal affairs investigators, their expressions neutral but probing. They had been tasked with piecing together exactly what had transpired during that fateful traffic stop. For nearly an hour, they asked Maya question after question, each one more detailed than the last. "Can you describe his tone when he spoke to you?" One investigator asked, scribbling notes on a legal pad. "Did he say anything specific that made you feel threatened?" Maya took a deep breath before answering. She recounted every detail, the aggressive accusations, the flashlight shining in her face, the way his body language shifted from irritation to hostility. When she mentioned the moment he drew his gun, her voice faltered slightly, but she quickly steadied herself. "He pointed it right at me," she said firmly, "and he didn't lower it until your team arrived." The investigators exchanged glances, clearly aware of how serious the allegations were. To pull a weapon on a federal agent, and not just any agent, but one who had calmly identified herself, was a breach of protocol so severe it bordered on criminal negligence. Still, they pressed on, asking about possible motives. Did Maya think the officer's actions were racially motivated? Had she ever encountered him before? Was there any chance this was personal? Maya hesitated before responding. The truth was, she couldn't say for certain why the officer had reacted the way he did, but she also couldn't ignore the subtle hints, the dismissive tone, the condescending remarks, the assumption that her badge was fake. It all pointed to something deeper than a simple misunderstanding. "I can't read his mind," she admitted finally, "but I do know how it felt to sit there while he laughed at my credentials. And I know what it feels like to be treated differently because of the color of my skin." Her words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, the room fell silent. The investigators nodded solemnly, jotting down her response without comment. They didn't need to agree or disagree. They simply needed the facts. And the facts painted a damning picture. Meanwhile, in another part of the building, the officer faced his own reckoning. Surrounded by stern-faced colleagues from internal affairs, he struggled to explain himself. At first, he clung to his initial defense, insisting that Maya had been uncooperative and defiant. But as the investigators played back footage from his patrol car's dashboard camera, cracks began to form in his story. The video showed Maya calm and compliant throughout the encounter, her movements slow and deliberate. There was no evidence of aggression or resistance on her part, only patience and professionalism. The officer grew increasingly defensive as the interrogation continued. "She reached for something," he protested, pointing at the screen. "How was I supposed to know she wasn't grabbing a weapon?" "She told you she was reaching for her badge," one investigator countered sharply. "You ignored her explanation and escalated the situation anyway. That's not standard procedure." Realizing his excuses weren't holding up, the officer slumped in his chair, defeated. He muttered something under his breath about being tired and stressed, but no one seemed sympathetic. The damage had already been done, not just to Maya, but to the trust between law enforcement and the community they served. Back in the other room, Maya leaned back in her chair, feeling the exhaustion settle into her bones. One of the investigators offered her a kind smile. "Thank you for sharing your account," he said gently. "We'll make sure this is handled properly." As Maya left the precinct later that night, she couldn't shake the sense that this was only the beginning. Justice might eventually be served, but true accountability required more than punishing one bad actor. It demanded confronting the biases and systemic issues that allowed such behavior to happen in the first place. Maya knew she had a choice. Let the experience harden her or use it as fuel to drive change. And as she stepped into the cool night air, She silently vowed to do the latter. The precinct buzzed with activity as news of the incident spread like wildfire. Officers whispered in hushed tones, their faces a mix of disbelief, anger, and unease. Some defended the officer who had been arrested, claiming he must have misunderstood the situation or acted out of stress. Others remained silent, unwilling to take sides but unable to ignore the weight of what had happened. In a corner of the room, Maya sat at a small table, her hands wrapped around a cup of lukewarm coffee. She felt drained, physically, mentally, and emotionally, but she knew this was far from over. Across from her sat two internal affairs investigators, their expressions neutral but probing. They had been tasked with piecing together exactly what had transpired during that fateful traffic stop. For nearly an hour, they asked Maya question after question, each one more detailed than the last. "Can you describe his tone when he spoke to you?" one investigator asked, scribbling notes on a legal pad. "Did he say anything specific that made you feel threatened?" Maya took a deep breath before answering. She recounted every detail. The aggressive accusations, the flashlight shining in her face, the way his body language shifted from irritation to hostility. When she mentioned the moment he drew his gun, her voice faltered slightly, but she quickly steadied herself. "He pointed it right at me," she said firmly, "and he didn't lower it until your team arrived." The investigators exchanged glances, clearly aware of how serious the allegations were. To pull a weapon on a federal agent, and not just any agent, but one who had calmly identified herself, was a breach of protocol so severe it bordered on criminal negligence. Still, they pressed on, asking about possible motives. Did Maya think the officer's actions were racially motivated? Had she ever encountered him before? Was there any chance this was personal? Maya hesitated before responding. The truth was, she couldn't say for certain why the officer had reacted the way he did, but she also couldn't ignore the subtle hints, the dismissive tone, the condescending remarks, the assumption that her badge was fake. It all pointed to something deeper than a simple misunderstanding. "I can't read his mind," she admitted finally. "But I do know how it felt to sit there while he laughed at my credentials. And I know what it feels like to be treated differently because of the color of my skin." Her words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, the room fell silent. The investigators nodded solemnly, jotting down her response without comment. They didn't need to agree or disagree. They simply needed the facts, and the facts painted a damning picture. Meanwhile, in another part of the building, the officer faced his own reckoning. Surrounded by stern-faced colleagues from internal affairs, he struggled to explain himself. At first, he clung to his initial defense, insisting that Maya had been uncooperative and defiant. But as the investigators played back footage from his patrol car's dashboard camera, cracks began to form in his story. The video showed Maya calm and compliant throughout the encounter, her movements slow and deliberate. There was no evidence of aggression or resistance on her part, only patience and professionalism. The officer grew increasingly defensive as the interrogation continued. "She reached for something," he protested, pointing at the screen. "How was I supposed to know she wasn't grabbing a weapon?" "She told you she was reaching for her badge," one investigator countered sharply. "You ignored her explanation and escalated the situation anyway. That's not standard procedure." Realizing his excuses weren't holding up, the officer slumped in his chair, defeated. He muttered something under his breath about being tired and stressed, but no one seemed sympathetic. The damage had already been done, not just to Maya, but to the trust between law enforcement and the community they served. Back in the other room, Maya leaned back in her chair, feeling the exhaustion settle into her bones. One of the investigators offered her a kind smile. "Thank you for sharing your account," he said gently. "We'll make sure this is handled properly." As Maya left the precinct later that night, she couldn't shake the sense that this was only the beginning. Justice might eventually be served, but true accountability required more than punishing one bad actor. It demanded confronting the biases and systemic issues that allowed such behavior to happen in the first place. Maya knew she had a choice. Let the experience harden her or use it as fuel to drive change. And as she stepped into the cool night air, she silently vowed to do the latter. The days following the interview were a whirlwind for Maya. Her story dominated headlines, sparking heated discussions in living rooms, workplaces, and legislative chambers across the country. Lawmakers, community leaders, and activists seized the moment to push for long-overdue reforms in policing practices. Protesters took to the streets in several cities, holding signs that read "Accountability saves lives" and "Respect every badge." The momentum was undeniable, but Maya knew that real change wouldn't come overnight. At the same time, not everyone welcomed her newfound visibility. Some critics dismissed her as an attention seeker or accused her of exploiting her position as an FBI agent to further a personal agenda. Online forums buzzed with conspiracy theories claiming she had orchestrated the entire incident to make law enforcement look bad. Even a few high-profile commentators weighed in, questioning whether the officer's actions warranted such severe consequences. It was just one mistake, one pundit argued on live TV. Are we really going to ruin someone's career over a misunderstanding? Maya braced herself for these attacks, knowing they came with the territory. But what surprised her most was how deeply some of the criticism stung. It wasn't the insults or baseless accusations. It was the implication that she should have simply moved on without speaking up. One particularly scathing article suggested she was dividing communities by bringing attention to systemic issues rather than fostering unity. Reading those words left her feeling conflicted and weary. Was she doing the right thing? Or was she making things worse? Her doubts didn't last long, though. Every time she felt discouraged, messages of support flooded her inbox. A young woman wrote to thank her for inspiring courage after years of staying silent about similar experiences. A retired police captain sent a heartfelt email praising her bravery and urging others in law enforcement to learn from the incident. Even strangers stopped her in public places to express their admiration. "Thank you for standing your ground," one elderly man said, his voice trembling with emotion. "We need more people like you." These moments reminded Maya why she had chosen to speak out in the first place. This wasn't about revenge or blame. It was about creating awareness, fostering dialogue, and pushing for meaningful reform. She began channeling her energy into action, collaborating with advocacy groups to address the root causes of bias within law enforcement. Together, they drafted proposals for improved training programs, civilian oversight boards, and mental health resources for officers under stress. One evening, Maya attended a town hall meeting organized by local activists. The room was packed with residents eager to share their thoughts and concerns about policing in their community. As she listened to their stories, some heartbreaking, others hopeful, she realized how much work still needed to be done. When it was her turn to speak, she stepped up to the microphone, drawing on every ounce of strength she had left. "This isn't just my fight," she said, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "It's all of ours. We can't fix decades of broken systems overnight, but we can start by listening to each other, by admitting there's a problem, and by working together to find solutions." Her words earned a standing ovation, but Maya knew applause wasn't enough. Real progress required hard work, persistence, and collaboration, and she was ready to roll up her sleeves. Over the next few weeks, she partnered with educators, psychologists, and former officers to design workshops aimed at teaching de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity. She also met with lawmakers to advocate for legislation that would hold officers accountable for misconduct while providing safeguards against false accusations. Despite the challenges, Maya found solace in the growing movement around her. People from all walks of life were coming together, united by a shared desire for justice and equality. For the first time since that fateful night, she allowed herself to feel a glimmer of hope, not because everything was perfect, but because so many were willing to fight for a better future. And yet Maya understood that true change wouldn't happen unless everyone played a part. It wasn't enough for individuals to stand up. Institutions had to evolve too. With renewed determination, she vowed to keep pushing forward, to turn pain into purpose and adversity into action. Because if one person's voice could spark a national conversation, imagine what millions could achieve together. Weeks turned into months, and the fallout from that tense evening on the highway continued to ripple through society. The officer at the center of the controversy faced disciplinary hearings, where his actions were scrutinized in painstaking detail. Surveillance footage from his patrol car, witness testimonies, and Maya's own account painted a damning picture. In the end, he was fired from the force and faced criminal charges for assault and misuse of authority. While some saw this as justice served, others viewed it as a wake-up call, a stark reminder of how quickly unchecked biases could escalate into dangerous situations. For Maya, the resolution brought a mix of relief and frustration. On one hand, she was glad the officer had been held accountable for his actions, but on the other, she couldn't shake the feeling that punishing one individual wasn't enough to fix the deeper problems plaguing law enforcement. "This isn't about one bad cop," she often said during interviews or panel discussions. "It's about addressing the systemic issues that allow these kinds of incidents to happen in the first place." Determined to turn her experience into something positive, Maya launched a nonprofit organization called Bridge and Build. Its mission was simple yet ambitious: to foster trust between communities and law enforcement by promoting open dialogue, education, and mutual understanding. Through workshops, training sessions, and community outreach programs, Maya worked tirelessly to bridge the gap between citizens and officers who swore to protect them. One of the flagship initiatives under Bridge and Build was a series of interactive workshops designed for both civilians and police officers. Participants engaged in role-playing exercises, empathy-building activities, and candid conversations about race, bias, and accountability. Officers learned de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity, while community members gained insight into the challenges officers faced daily. The goal wasn't just to teach, but to humanize, to remind everyone involved that behind every badge or protest sign was a person with fears, hopes, and dreams. The response was overwhelming. Initially met with skepticism from some corners of law enforcement, the program gradually gained traction as success stories began to emerge. One veteran officer admitted during a session that he'd never realized how intimidating his tone could sound until someone pointed it out. Another participant, a young mother, shared how the workshop helped her see officers not as adversaries, but as partners in keeping neighborhoods safe. Slowly but surely, walls began to come down, replaced by bridges built on respect and understanding. Maya's efforts didn't stop there. She partnered with educators to develop school curriculums focused on civic responsibility and conflict resolution, ensuring the next generation grew up equipped to navigate difficult conversations. She also lobbied for policy changes at the state and federal levels, advocating for independent oversight boards to review cases of alleged misconduct and increase transparency within police departments. Despite the progress, Maya knew the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth. Resistance lingered in certain circles, and setbacks were inevitable. But she refused to let cynicism cloud her vision. Every small victory, whether it was an officer admitting fault or a community member extending forgiveness, reinforced her belief that change was possible. On quiet evenings, Maya would sit by her window, reflecting on everything she'd been through. That night on the highway had tested her in ways she never imagined, but it had also revealed her strength. She thought about the countless people who had reached out to thank her, confide in her, or simply share their hope for a better future. Their voices reminded her why she kept going, even when the weight of the world felt unbearable. As she looked toward the horizon, Maya allowed herself a rare moment of optimism. True change took time, patience, and collective effort. But if history taught her anything, it was that even the smallest ripples could grow into waves capable of reshaping entire landscapes. And those scars from that fateful night would always remain. Maya wore them proudly, as reminders of her resilience and as fuel for the fight ahead. Her journey wasn't over, but she no longer walked it alone. Together, step by step, She and countless others were paving the way toward a brighter, fairer tomorrow.